So there's a Liberal Democrat MP called Wera Hobhouse. She's a German immigrant, and that's relevant. And she is in Bath, one of the most quintessentially English, high trust and homogenous places in the country. And she's promoting the launch of a paper in Parliament which says that all immigrants, including illegal immigrants, should get the vote. The paper is called What If Everyone Could Vote? Mapping Unenfranchised Residents Across the UK. Now, unenfranchised is an insidious, very Rousseauian way of framing it, because if you notice the way they coach this language, the default position of every single human being, per that framing, is that they have the vote. They are franchised. And so if they are unenfranchised, some hidden hand of oppression is withdrawing their right to participate in egalitarian fashion in the political process. I'd like to coin a Connor's law. I've said this before, but if you go looking in a confusing news story for the blank slate, you will find it as the underlying logic to that news story. So in this instance, everyone starts from the position of being free and equal and enfranchised. And per progressive logic, if they were to participate without any barriers into the political process, because we are all free and equal blank slates, they'd come to the conclusion that voting for Labour or the Liberal Democrats or the Greens or the Democrats in the US or the Liberal Party in Canada are in their best interest. Because, of course, the progressives are speaking for everyone. They're the equality parties. And so, if we just remove the barriers to entry, arbitrary things like who's legal in the country and who isn't, and who's old enough to vote, and who hasn't committed a crime, pointless distinctions like that. If we just remove those, then we'll all vote for the egalitarian utopia that the likes of the Liberal Democrats are trying to bring into being. It's interesting, though, because the Liberal Democrats, for those outside the UK, they want to exist in something akin to Sylvanian families or a Beatrix Potter book, right? Their version of England are these 18th century architecture towns that are populated with people that are the equivalent of talking animals and straw hats, right? Full of English eccentrics, very polite. They say please and thank you when they get on the bus. They clap when the plane lands. They queue. And they know maybe one nice Indian chap who's their local doctor. And they don't see how importing unlimited numbers of people from sub-Saharan Africa or the Indian subcontinent might somehow threaten that. Because there's no logical connection in their mind to enough people being in one place, believing one thing, changing the conditions of a country. To them, the soil is kind of magic. As soon as your souls make contact with it, you become as indistinguishably British as Henry VIII or Winston Churchill, who I'm sure they would call a racist and far right, were they transported to this time and see what they've done with the place. However, they don't understand that these people in a large enough number make the exact country that they've come from, which is undesirable. They just think that a lack of education and economic opportunities is why those countries are the way they are. It's not like intractable cultural preferences that don't magically fall away the moment they step through the passport gates of Heathrow and Gatwick, or, heaven forbid, wash up on Dover Beach from a dinghy from France. However, this delusion does not stop them. And so this Liberal Democrat MP has partnered with the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, who Charlotte Gill on Substack of Woke Waste and Doge UK has done excellent work digging into, spent 17 million in funding since 2015, including £878,024 on Lib Dem councillors and £694,145 to the Lib Dem party itself. The Rowntree Foundation are also funding the Fabian Society, whose logo is a wolf in sheep's clothing, and they're the oldest socialist group in the country, and the Migrant Democracy Project, who wrote this paper. And they believe every resident, no matter where they are from, should have equal access to democracy. Again, see the blank slate in action. The Lib Dems, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and the Migrant Democracy Project have produced and promoted this report. And in the foreword, it says, 1 in 6 residents in England and Wales were born abroad. That's 16% of the population. As our society changes, our democracy needs to remain fit for purpose and remain inclusive of all members of the community. Now, again, very blank slate. The premise is that every single person is indistinguishable, and as soon as they make contact with Britain and its institutions, the scales shall fall from their eyes and they will all vote for freedom and equality. They won't form ethnic and religious sectarian blocs like the Muslim vote or those pushing the Hindu manifesto, and leverage an outsized influence on democracy to ensure that tribal minoritarian concerns are made the priority of British politics rather than things like cleaning sewage out of the waters or making sure the trains aren't full of people that are playing music out loud on speakerphone, which are actually the Lib Dems' core issues. I mean, if you monitored the Lib Dems campaign at the last election, Ed Davey ran as a kind of Brewster's Millions candidate, kind of anti-political candidate. His campaign involved stunts of him pratfalling off of paddleboards or going on rides at Alton Towers. He's now doing these sort of weird dances in front of a camera on TikTok. That's going to get clipped, isn't it? Of him defying Donald Trump with the latest sort of shuffling dad dance trend. He's in the mold of Mark Carney, basically. He wants to position himself as a Europhile, as supporting Ukraine, as being compassionate to refugees, as being pro-trans, as being against the big bad meanies of Trump and Netanyahu, I suppose, and extolling about the loss of life in Gaza. All of these things are absolute luxury beliefs because they are in the most sheltered, leafy suburbs and towns that have been hitherto unmolested by mass migration in England. And so they can support all of these beliefs without ever needing to make contact with reality. Well, a policy like this, a paper like this that says that illegal migrants can vote might end up bringing the downsides of diversity into those Lib Dem neighbourhoods. Now, the paper complains 4.4 million residents are unenfranchised in parliamentary elections. So that hypothetically counts illegal immigrants in the country. We have a minimum of 1.2 million here. The last time we checked that was Pew Research in 2017. As soon as the Boris wave of migration came in and unprecedented numbers from low-cost countries like the Third World or China came in, the Home Office have just stopped counting visa overstays. So we have no idea how many illegal immigrants in the country, but it's at least 1.2 to 2 million at this point. They're complaining that people like that can't vote. Presumably because they think that, if they just give them the right to vote, they'll vote for them, the Freedom and Equality Party, rather than voting for the Hindu Party or the Islam Party or whether the other sectarian interest bloc springs up. And they say, and their chief complaint is that per the 1948 British Nationality Act that gives Commonwealth citizens the vote, this is, quote, intimately connected with the colonial history of the United Kingdom. You know what? You're absolutely right. Thank you, Liberal Democrat MP. Let's get rid of it then. This is why the Liberal Democrats are actually coding as the accidentally most racist party in the UK. There's this video that Ed Davey put out the other day saying that he's going to give fines to people who play music and social media clips and TikToks out loud on trains because it's noisy and uncomfortable. And I agree with him, perfectly reasonable. He doesn't realise that that's going to have a disparate impact. Because I would ask Ed Davey, why has that increased dramatically since 2021, when something happened and Boris Johnson and Priti Patel just opened the floodgates to mass migration from outside of Europe, where in common culture, there's no such thing as a public space. There's just your house and the wilderness, this ungovernable world where you can just throw your rubbish and play things aloud and not have any consideration for anyone except your family and clan because it's just not your responsibility. It is incomprehensible, for example, that British taxpayers would mow the grass verges that are on the pavement outside their house rather than just leave the council to do it if the council doesn't do it. My dad goes out and maintains those grass verges. I maintain my front garden, things like that. It's incomprehensible to them to do that, and it's incomprehensible for them to not just throw rubbish on there or throw rubbish in someone else's garden just because it's not theirs and someone else will take care of it. Northwest Europe just has a much more, and I hesitate to say it, but Protestant way of devolving morality down to the individual. And that has its excesses. See the bleeding heart of pathological compassion and liberalism and universalism. But it also has its benefits in that we maintain high standards and we consider other people in public spaces. And so this is why the Liberal Democrats are putting forward these policies about punishing people that play music aloud, but they don't realize that this is a phenomena that is culturally isolated to not the English. I wonder if these kinds of policies for making illegal immigrants voting might bring a sharp awareness of this phenomena. The final thing I'll say on this is, if they're going to give the franchise to everyone just by being a resident in the UK, does this mean that Ukrainian refugees can vote in our elections? Because there's hundreds of thousands of them here now, and they're only on temporary stay. They're not permanently settled. They're not given indefinite leave to remain. They want to go home if Ukraine ever gets all of its territory reclaimed. Fair enough. They're defending themselves against Russian aggression. I would want my homeland back too. But does this mean that under this proposed paper, if it were to be implemented, they would be able to vote in our elections? Because then they could just vote us into a full-scale war, right? If there are a sufficient number of them here or a sufficient number of them in a given locality, they could elect a very bellicose MP, especially if it was an MP who was a member of the government and became a member of the cabinet, then they could escalate tensions and involve the host population in an armed conflict that they themselves would not fight because they couldn't join the British Army or just wouldn't be inclined to. What about if illegals can vote, a hostile country just sending thousands of its foreign nationals over the English Channel, coming into our country, and even if they're not given asylum, they're allowed to vote because they're claiming asylum and they're currently residents in the UK. So could a bunch of the members of the Taliban, considering Afghans and Eritreans are now the leading number of men crossing the channel, just come over and soften British government policy towards terror groups? Or, for example, could the Chinese, as they did with the American southern border, just send loads of its nationals over and ensure that the Chinese government gets more of a hearing in UK foreign affairs? Or maybe Chinese students. I mean, British universities are very reliant on Chinese students. You know, we take in thousands of them every year. Can they vote? Because then you've got the sons and daughters of the CCP who universities are reliant on because they pay all their fees and they pay more than your British student up front, and they pay for some of the best student accommodation, so they keep that industry, that sort of cottage industry in university towns alive. Could they vote? This is an insane plan to peddle foreign influence. And I think it's because, as well, partially, this Lib Dem MP is a German immigrant, and she's also of Jewish descent. Now, if you're German and Jewish, there might be some problems in the 20th century that make you a little bit more inclined to buy into the blank slate anti-racist narrative than the country should have borders narrative. Because the country should have borders narrative to your average midwit liberal has been sold as leading ineluctably to Nazism. Now, not every Jewish person thinks this. Of course, Eric Kaufman, Paul Morland, the Hazoni family, they realize that actually countries should be a bit more like Israel in being salient of themselves as a people, as a religious group, as a nation, and defend themselves against existential threats, and as a country, as a people, make alliances with countries and other peoples that have their best interests at heart, rather than being completely open borders and reducing their identity down to grey goo, when other civilizations and religions like Islam have much more strong in-group preferences and imperial ambitions, and so they will not acquiesce to this universal vision of kumbaya liberalism where we're all holding hands like John Lennon's Imagine. Instead, they'll cross your borders and kill and abuse you in the name of Allah. And so I think that is the sort of driving, noxious force behind thinking that every single person, by the virtue of being in Britain as subject to its post-war laws, is identical, is a blank slate, if given the franchise, will vote for equality. I think this is a dangerous delusion, and supporting it means they will come for the Shires. And where else they'll come for the Shires is in this plan by the Labour Party to deploy people all over Britain in taxpayer-funded accommodation. Now, I have to read this list out to you. Serco, right, is one of the security contractors, one of three, that the government uses to house illegal migrants that cross the channel in dispersed accommodation across the country. It costs £14 a day versus the £145 a day to house them in four-star hotels. Now, any money spent on them is an injustice to the law-abiding British taxpayer, of course, but they're playing Mott and Bailey, right? They're saying, we're going to tackle the people smuggling gangs, we're going to reduce the incentives for illegal migrants across the channel by putting them in slightly less comfortable conditions at your expense. No, people are still going to come over because relative to their third world shanty towns, dispersed private rented accommodation is much better prospect. Also, this is in the midst of said housing crisis where Labour are promising to build 1.5 million homes, but also import 2.5 million migrants over that period. So 70% of those new homes will go to migrants, and now they're procuring private rented accommodation in various towns and cities across the UK for illegal migrants. So they're rewarding them. I just have to read you this list because despite their attempt to deny it, illegal migration is coming to a town near you. And if the Lib Dems have their way, they'll get the vote. So, towns in east of England are Barbara mid-Suffolk, Breckland, Broadlands, Cambridge, East Cambridgeshire, East Suffolk, Fenland, Great Yarmouth, where Rupert Lowe I'm sure will be repelling them, Ipswich, Kings Lynn and West Norfolk, mid-Suffolk, Norfolk, Norwich, Peterborough, South Cambridgeshire in Camborne and Sawston, South Norfolk, West Suffolk in Bury, Newmarket, Brandon, Haverhill and Mildenhall. And in the Midlands it's Amber Valley, Ashfield, Bassetlaw, Birmingham, Blaby, Bolsover, Boston, Bromsgrove and Redditch, Broxtowe, Cannock Chase, Charnwood, Chesterfield, Derby, Derbyshire Dales, Dunley, East Lindsey, East Staffordshire, Erewash, Gedling, Harborough, Hertfordshire County, High Peak, Hinckley and Bosworth, Huntingdonshire, Leicester, Lincoln, Lichfield, Malvern Hills, Mansfield, Melton, Newark and Sherwood, Newcastle under Lyme. There's literally no corner of the country that won't be touched by illegal migrants. North East Derbyshire, North Kesteven, North Northamptonshire in Kettering, Corby and Wellingborough, North Warwickshire, North West Leicestershire, Nottingham, Nuneaton and Bedworth, Oadby and Wigston, Rugby, Rushcliffe, Rutland, Sandwell, Shropshire, Solihull, South Derbyshire, South Holland, South Kesteven, South Staffordshire, Staffordshire Moorlands, Stoke-on-Trent, Stratford-on-Avon, where the Bard, I'm sure, after being fresh from decolonisation, will welcome in all of its new doctors, lawyers and engineers. Tamworth, Telford and Wrekin, Walsall, Warwick, West Lindsey, West Northamptonshire, Wolverhampton, Worcester, Withercombe, and Weir Forest. Oh, and there's some more in the northwest. That's Allerdale, Barrow-in-Furness, Blackburn and Darwen, Blackpool, Bolton, Burnley, Bury, Carlisle, Cheshire East, Cheshire West and Chester, so I was right, Chorley, Copeland, Copeland, of course, Eden, Flyde, Halton, Hindburn, Knowsley, Lancaster, Liverpool, Manchester, Oldham, Pendle, Preston, Ribble Valley, Rochdale, Rosendale, Salford, Sefton, South Lakeland, South Ribble, Stockport, St Helens, Thameside, Trafford, Warrington, West Lancashire, Wigan, Wirral and Weir. There are approximately 1.3 million people on the waiting list for this dispersed accommodation at the moment. So that means that lots of the towns and cities that have seen the Pakistani rape gangs operate in their area are about to get a bunch of unvetted foreign nationals from places like Afghanistan and Eritrea, where they're more likely to commit sex offences, 20 times more likely than a British national. They're about to get a whole lot more potential offenders. And we're paying for it. And the Lib Dems think they should vote.